From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And coming up today, K-State's Dan O'Brien on the grain markets. He'll talk about the pre-harvest direction that the wheat market seems to be taking and why selling right off the combine might not be the preferred option this year. And he'll comment on more good export news for soybeans, among other things. Also in today, K-State's Ignacio Ciampitti and Ana Carcedo. They'll discuss the variables of grain sorghum planting and things you producers can focus on to maximize your planting success, including seeding rate and plant population targets to match field yield potential and aligning that planting date with hybrid maturity. And awaiting with the latest Kansas agricultural weather outlook, K-State's Chip Redmond. On this, Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network, and you're tuned to Agriculture Today. Thanks for joining us once more. We'll get caught up on the latest developments in the grain markets now, as we usually do on a Friday. And along with us is K-State Research and Extension grain market economist Dan O'Brien, once more from his office in Colby, northwest Kansas. Well, let's begin on wheat since, well, there are many reasons for doing this, Dan. We have a harvest that's only a couple of weeks away from beginning in the state, and the wheat prices of the week are in retreat for the most part. Yesterday, a bit of stability, but they seem to be heading the wrong direction. What's happening?
Well, in the world market, there was a lot of, attention to news about Turkey working with Russia, who they're on friendly terms with, to be able to find a pathway to move wheat out of Ukraine into world market channels. And the big issue behind that is that the world wheat trade and world wheat overall, supply-demand-wise, really feels the effect of the wedge now, I guess we call it, the void of the Ukraine crop not coming into world channels. Again, you're looking at an area that was referred to for decades and decades or longer as the breadbasket of Europe, that being Ukraine. And it's become apparent that when you look at their supply-demand numbers, and again, our colleague Antonio Braca has discussed that, the issue of Ukraine having wheat in storage, that it can't move, and quality concerns, et cetera. So all that is there. So our wheat market was paying attention to that. And when I say our market in the U.S., it seems that some of the speculative forces that came in and helped to drive wheat up, and again, the July contract that ran up as high as about $13.80, $13.90, now dropped on yesterday's close down to $11.43. So about $2.50 of drop. Some of that probably is just the sheer physical reality of Kansas wheat harvest coming in, even though that harvest will be reduced, it sure seems like, from what we're hearing, from what people would have hoped for. So anyway, we've had that price drop. Still, the overall world wheat supply-demand fundamentals is just tight. World minus China stocks projected by the USDA, even with expectations that about half of normal Ukraine wheat will make it into world channels, and that's probably a pretty heroic projection, still down to 19.5%. And that compares to world minus China stocks use of 21.4 last year, and that was the lowest in about 10 or 12 years. So historic lows, very, very tight supply-demand situation for wheat, and that's just supporting prices at levels that Eric, that you and I, over the last 3 or 4, 5, 6 years prior to this, would have just dreamed of. Couldn't have dreamed we'd be here, but we are. And cash prices, even after dropping $2.50 over the last couple weeks, in Colby, northwest Kansas, $10.75 as a cash price, $10.69 in Columbus, $10.47 in Garden City. Those are the lowest prices in the state. But then $11.28, $11.18, $11.28 in Salina, Topeka, Hutchinson. By the time harvest actually happens, it's going to really be interesting to see, what actually rules the day. Will the availability of some wheat supplies be at issue, or will there be a strong rush to gobble up and get control of any supplies that are available. Mm-hmm. I would think Kansas farmers, I wouldn't be surprised that they won't be that anxious to sell wheat right off the bat, because they read these same reports that we do, and they're very aware of that world situation. So I know where we stand right now prior to harvest, but it's going to be really interesting to see what this competitive arbitrage process will do in the next several weeks once harvest starts up. And people will be trying to buy wheat from the hands of sellers that in a lot of cases have 2/3, 3/4, hopefully, of their normal yields, and want to make sure they maximize price this year.
Could be a seller's market. That would be very important in this state for sure, for that to continue. On the row crop side, corn planting, well, you might be able to declare it now, in broad terms, a success. Certainly here in Kansas, but in the better part of the Corn Belt as well.
Well, that seems to be the case. Over the top 18 states for corn production, the last 5-year average would be about, on this date, about 87% planted, and 86 is where we were at in 2022 on May the 29th, and that was a few days ago. So when you look at corn emergence, we're trailing a little bit more with that, 68% emerged as the 5-year average, and we're at 61. Really, the states we're most concerned about would be, well, North Dakota, basically, and North Dakota, Minnesota, South Dakota, and corn plantings in North Dakota, normally 83% done, projected on May the 29th at 56, and emergence at 7%, and 42 would be the 5-year average. So still concerns up in that part of the world and in some of those adjacent states. South Dakota trailing a little bit, Minnesota trailing some about 30%. So that's an issue. I didn't mention for wheat that we have grave concerns about planting of the spring wheat crop up in there. And so here in the hard red area, when you look at the soil condition, crop prospects for hard red winter wheat out of Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, and then look up to the Dakotas for hard red spring wheat and white wheat right next door, heading into Montana and such. This would have been such a tremendous year to have great production, but we're just struggling in a lot of these major areas. But back on corn, we've had some pretty healthy exports, and apparently ethanol use is holding it pretty well. So the demand side doing well. Apparently ethanol, with encouragement from EPA and loosening of regulations, et cetera, as I understand them anyway, we're declining in stocks, and I think the U.S. economy, the U.S. government, probably anxious to have ethanol come in and take the top off of where gasoline prices could go. And by the way, out in western Kansas, we're well past $4 now and heading for $4.50 in terms of gas prices. So ethanol is in position to help that out in terms of having additional motor fuel supplies in the market, and that's one factor, frankly, supporting these strong corn prices at elevators. Lowest price at the places we watch, $7.15 in Salinas, $7.30 in Columbus, and that's down about $1.50 or more from the highs that we'd had just a bit ago. Mm-hmm. I would say here we're coming into June. Planting has happened. Seasonally, are we looking at the type of a situation we've seen in the past where we have strong corn prices on the new crop side, or during this period when we question how the crop's going to get in, or whether it will successfully get planted, and then is the market assuming that, well, it's going to be planted, we're going to have a great crop, et cetera. Well, we could be seeing some of that also. That said, still they have crop problems in Brazil, and you can see that in our exports. So even though we've had this decline, it sure seems that we have a lot of uncertainty to wrestle with from June through July and August before we declare that, hey, we're moving a whole lot lower into the harvest time.
Well, soybeans are definitely, Dan, being propped up by ongoing, very reliable soybean export business. China was again reportedly back in the market this week, and with that and the fact that soybean planting is in okay shape, it sounds steady as she goes, at least on the soybean market, isn't it?
Nothing that you and I have talked about in past weeks has really changed in terms of the aggressiveness of forward purchasing. Again, we've got about 14, 15 weeks left in this marketing year, and the forward purchases for the rest of this year would take U.S. soybean total purchases above what the USDA has projected. So that puts you in a position to wonder at the next WASDE report, which I think will be on the 10th, week from today, will the USDA raise that export number again and tighten up stock? So that's there. On the price side, we're still trading in that range, in a range of about $17.50 on the top to about $15.50 on the bottom side. And we closed yesterday at $17.29. So we've been trading in that range since early March. So I guess with the strength of demand and that the shortfall that happened to a degree in the South American market, we're looking pretty good for soybean prices. And if anything, will these high prices for soybeans and some of the shortfall we've seen for corn on the margin pull even a few more acres on the backside of this planting season into soybeans? And they really can't go to corn. A lot of these areas we've hit the crop insurance dates. So we don't have a lot of options. And if people do come out of the backside of their corn planting window, then their soybeans waiting with such tremendous prices and market opportunities that it would seem to be an opportunity.
Very well. Well, Dan again puts together copious notes on the grain markets for your review, producers, and we'd invite you to have a look at the latest edition on the agmanager.info website, agmanager.info. Dan, enjoy your weekend, and once again, we'll talk next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
From Colby, Northwest Kansas, Dan O'Brien, grain market economist with K-State Research and Extension on Agriculture Today. Now a quick break. When we come back, input on grain sorghum planting approaches. Our next two guests will get into that in a moment here on the K-State Radio Network. You are tuned into Agriculture Today, and welcome back. Here we are now in the month of June, and it is grain sorghum planting time in Kansas. Field conditions allowing here, of course, depending on where you are in the state. For you here, some sorghum management considerations at planting time, pulled together by our guests, crop production and cropping systems specialist with K-State Research and Extension, Ignacio Ciampitti, and a postdoc researcher here at K-State working with Ignacio, Ana Carcedo. Start with you, Ignacio. Quite a bit can be made in the way of plant potential at planting time, right?
Yes, Eric, as always, thanks for the invitation. And I think that just before we start, we need to identify some of the key factors that we put together on this article when we're looking at sorghum planting recommendations. And one of the first that we're planning to discuss will be specifically on seeding rates and plant populations. Then Ana will move and to introduce a little bit on the planting date and hybrid selection, and we will try to finish on this row spacing and all the interactions of these factors. If we go for plant density, many times when we talk about sorghum, many people will say, well, plant density or seeding rates is not really a big factor for sorghum when we compare it with corn. And if we look at the seed cost, it's not as large, as compared with corn. So in many situations, it looks like plant density is not a real deal for sorghum. I always want to go back and try to think and discuss with farmers this idea of matching the plant density, with the precipitation, with the right environment. So if I'm looking for a high-yielding environment, so if I'm moving eastern part of the state, I will start thinking about increasing my seeding rate. And then if I'm starting to go west, where precipitation starts going down, and then we move from 30-inch all the way to 10 inches, then is when we start looking at cutting that plant density seeding rates. And in many situations, we go from recommended high-yielding 80,000 maybe, and all the way from, in many situations, less than 30.
K-State Research has affirmed those numbers, has really categorized those seeding rates attuned to the growing conditions and the moisture, of course, driving that largely.
Yeah, many times is this category, we have a table that we put together in that article, and then a distinction that we can say is that there is a difference on terminology between seeding rate and plant density. So seeding rate is what is our target, and then the plant density is what is the final number of plants attained in the field after all seeds are emerging. And then the idea is that we usually try to use a number that it could be 70% from the target. That number can change. So if a farmer is trying to target 32,000 plants in the field, we know that we need to at least put 20-30% more on seeding rate to make sure that you get to that number. Mm-hmm. That's the first point. In many situations, depending on your planting condition, we might need to even increase that. If we are going into dry conditions where we are expecting more mortality early season, or if we are going into wet, we are not closing the wheel, we are not closing that row line. So there are many situations that increasing seeding rate can be a factor to consider more when you are thinking about your target population. The other couple of things is also the tillering effect. In many crops, we don't even talk about this effect. But sorghum can tiller. And then this is another additional, I would always say, complexity for the crop because we might be down on densities, and we have many examples working with farmers a couple of years, that you might be down on your optimal density, but if we are in a good growing season with sun, rain, and good nutrient conditions, you might tiller. And then what we are looking at the end of the day is not about only the number of plants that we put in the field, but what are the possibilities of those plants to develop tillers. And then at the end of the day, the question can be the same. If I'm looking to have 40,000 heads in order to maximize my yields, those can come 30,000 from main plants and 10,000 from tillers. The only thing is that we need to be careful on the tillering because there are situations that they express and help to express tillering, like good growing conditions, moisture, nutrients. And there might be some other situations that if the season turns to be dry entirely to July, it could be a situation that we might not see that many number of tillers. Right. And that's some of the things that we need to consider on the seeding rate. The other point, planting too late, and some people will say, what is late for sorghum, right? We are already targeting, in many situations, planting sorghum in June. So I would say if you are thinking about planting sorghum in July, be careful and then make sure that you increase your seeding rates. Because in many situations, what will happen is the ability for those plants to produce tillers is really compromised. So we need to add at least 10, 15, or even 20% more plants, more seeds, to maximize that light interception. And we have less number of days. So the only way to really compensate or to produce some compensation will come from basically having more plants.
Right. Again, be realistic about the expected yielding environment that you're working with. That's core to this. And let's bring Ana in to talk about planting dates and the latitude that producers have where they can still succeed with the planting, even if it is on the later end of the calendar. What does the research say about that, Ana?
First of all, hi, Eric. Thank you for the invitation.
You bet.
Basically, we did kind of a summary of the research here in K-State. Basically, what we found is that early June plantings actually had big yields. But not only that, because you can have actually high yields in other planting dates, and it's of course depending on the weather of the year. But what we found out that's actually more interesting is that early June planting dates have more stability. I have to say that most of the sorghum farmers will aim for that. Another thing that actually kind of Ignacio was mentioning before is that it's actually related to the late planting dates, is that you can tailor your selection of the maturity hybrid that you are using to fit the season. So when you are actually talking about planting dates, you cannot talk about planting dates separate from hybrid maturity. So you can actually boost your early planting dates using longer maturities. When you find for any reason that you have to plant late, you can actually use shorter maturities to fit the growing season. It's important to have at least 2 weeks before the freezing, probable dates, at least 2 weeks before the freezing.
Because it's essential that crop have a chance to finish.
Yes.
And that's pretty straightforward, though, it seems, Ana, isn't it, as far as the planting dates and aligning those hybrid selections?
Yes, but actually it's not the only factor that you have to consider.
Okay.
So one of the main points is the blooming moment. So you want to fit your blooming in the best weather conditions. You want your crop to have water, to don't have a heat stress. You want your crop to be the healthiest possible in the blooming.
That's why you concentrate on that days to blooming rating of those hybrids then.
Yes, you want to put actually like last week of August will be the perfect moment. And you get that from the combination of like short hybrids sowing late and long hybrids sowing earlier.
Well, we also need to talk briefly here, Ignacio, about row spacing, how that factors into this. There's been a lot of discussion about that and the appeal of narrow rows.
And the two main points that narrow rows are why they are so relevant. One is connected to weed control, because we wanted to close the canopy early and make sure that we kind of keep that field very clean. Second one is we want to intercept more light quickly, convert all this light into green biomass, and then from there increase yields. That's the overall equation. And if you look at the recommendations and the data that we collected and we summarized on this article, it looks like when we are using narrow rows and yields are above 70 bushels, which is kind of a medium-low type of yield for sorghum, all the times we see benefits on using narrow rows. And, of course, the benefits on the high-yielding side, when we are talking about more than 100-plus bushels, are coming because of light interception. So we are closing that canopy much faster, intercepting light. And then in those conditions, narrow rows are excellent. And also we are seeing potential benefits coming that there are indirect benefits on the weed control side. The only point of concern, and I don't think that yet apply for this year, although if we were talking about this a month ago, probably yes, is dry conditions. If we are in a really dry environment, we might start seeing some stress situations. So these narrow rows, they tend to compete much faster because as we are approximating these rows, we are increasing that early season competition, and then the competition is not only above ground for light, but it's also below ground, the roots, for water and nutrients. So unless we have timely rains in environments that are really dry, that narrow rows can put us on a bad situation. So far, most of the data shows that if we are in 100 bushels plus, or even 70, narrow rows is a no-brainer, it's a good practice. Most of the problems that we might face on narrow rows are coming from the planter equipment. And that's one of the things that for many farmers out there, if you are doing narrow rows and if you are changing your equipment, make sure that you check your settings. We might need to increase seeding rates just to make sure that you kind of compare these narrow rows when you are using your planter on 30-inch.
Very good. You've captured all of this in this article, Sorghum Management Considerations, Planting Practices. You and Ana authored this, and it's in the Agronomy E-Update newsletter from last Thursday. Check that out at agronomy.ksu.edu. Thanks for coming over, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Along with Ignacio Ciampitti, crop production and cropping system specialist at K-State, a postdoc researcher working with Ignacio, Ana Carcedo. You're listening to Agriculture Today. This Agriculture Today closes out on Kansas agricultural weather. And with the latest from the Weather Data Library here at K-State, here's Chip Redmond, meteorologist with K-State Research and Extension. Well, Chip, rainfall and sufficient to excessive rainfall the last week and a half in Kansas, and just right to the latest drought monitor and whether it captures some of that moisture.
Yeah, it's the haves and have-nots, however, still. The eastern and even central part of the state has just got a ton of rain. Over 3 inches, 4 inches, 5 inches in several isolated areas over the last 7 days. We look back over the last 2 weeks, you can almost draw a line from basically Phillips County down to, about Clark County and east have all gotten 2 to 5 to 6 inches of rain. And that's well above normal for even this time of year where we do average a lot of moisture. And so we had positive drought impacts with drought reduction in much of those areas that had drought, especially central Kansas, where we saw a rare 2-category improvement from severe drought to abnormally dry conditions, which is a rare, and that happened in north central. To the west of that line, though, that Phillips-Clark County line, it still remains really dry. The far northwest got some moisture, about an inch over the last 2 weeks, that kind of offset their normals, but there's some new areas of really dry conditions especially emerging from that Scott County to Lane County up into Trigo County area. That area has become very, very dry and missed out on almost all of the moisture for the last 2 weeks. And they continue to see drought persist with some potential for increasing drought as well.
In a few moments, we'll talk about the potential for relief for those areas badly in need. The temperatures, they've been up and down. We've had a few hot days, but then these cool-offs that have tended to linger for a few days as well, Chip.
Yeah, we've actually kind of built back in that northwest kind of flow that we saw over the winter and into early spring. That was a dry pattern for us, but now we've got enough of that moisture northward that it's helping with showers and thunderstorms with each frontal passage that comes through. And that really helps keep a lid on the temperatures when they do warm. And then once we have a cold front come through, you see much cooler temperatures post-frontal. And so as a result, we're tying together 3, 4, 5 days in a row below normal temperatures, followed by a day of maybe warmer than normal temperatures. So, it might be welcome to some folks after what was a very warm May that ended on a cool note. To keep that cool note into June is kind of a relief.
To the outlook then into the weekend and through the next week, once more we're seeing eventually here more rounds of rainfall, but where will that take place is the critical question here.
Yeah, I hope my forecast is correct when I say that the Weather Prediction Center is calling for pretty much equal chances across most of the state to see above normal precipitation through the next 7 days. So that would take us into late next week, which would be around the 9th of June. We're talking 1.5 to 2 inches of rain widespread. But keep in mind, just because that forecast calls for it doesn't mean it's going to happen everywhere. It's convective summertime storm systems that drop really isolated higher amounts and are not nearly quite as widespread as predicted. But we can be optimistic in saying that, the forecast a couple weeks ago was not very good. Mm-hmm. And we have added some moisture to that, and hopefully we're keeping that trend with above normal precipitation through the next week. And once again, though, temperatures are expected to be below normal for the next 7 days.
All right. Hey, always appreciate it. We'll talk again next week. Many thanks to you, Chip.
Yep, thanks. Have a great weekend.
He's along with us each Friday to talk Kansas agricultural weather is Chip Redmond, meteorologist with K-State Research and Extension. That is our time for this week, and we thank you for being along with us. Enjoy your weekend as well. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.